There are three things that affect the own price elasticity of demand for different products. Okay, and the first and probably the most important is availability and the number of substitutes for that product. Okay, and then the second one is the time that a consumer has to make adjustments to their purchasing behavior after a price change. Okay, and then the third is the expenditure share of consumers' budgets. Okay, so let's look at these one at a time. Okay, so for the availability and number of substitutes, as the number of substitutes increases, demand becomes more elastic. Okay, so think about that. As imagine you're confronted with a price increase, and so that makes you want to buy less of the product. And if you can easily find something that takes the place of the product whose price has gone up, then you will be more than happy to go ahead and totally not buy anything, any amount of the product whose price has gone up. Okay, and vice versa, as the availability and number of substitutes decreases, demand becomes less elastic. Okay, so let's look at some examples. Okay, there's some examples in the textbook. Table 3.2. They give you examples for whole milk and milk, meat, beef, steak, tea, and pepper. And to show you some different numbers. Okay, this is table 3.2 from, I believe, the 8th edition of the textbook. And I think this was the same numbers that was in the 9th edition. Okay, and the source of this is from the textbook author, Mike Bay, I think David Jansen and Lee, in a paper they published in 1992. So it's a little bit dated, but it still shows some examples of elasticities. Okay, so the elasticity for transportation is minus 0.6, and the elasticity for motor vehicles is minus 1.4. Okay, so looking at those two commodity definitions tells us something about the number of substitutes. So transportation is a broader category than motor vehicles. Okay, if a commodity is defined broadly, then there's going to be fewer substitutes. What's the substitute for transportation? Well, not much. There's no substitute. You just stay home. Okay, but the substitutes for motor vehicles a type of transportation includes walking, bicycling, flying a plane, and maybe some others. And so since there's more substitutes, the demand becomes more elastic. It goes from 0.6 to 1.4 in absolute value. Okay, and then the demand for motorcycles and bicycles is even more elastic than motor vehicles. Okay, and you see the same relationship for food and cereal. Cereal is a type of food, and so there's more substitutes for cereal than there is for food. There's no substitute for this broad category of food. So the demand for cereal is more elastic, 1.5, because there are more substitutes. And you see the same thing for clothing and women's clothing. Okay, now what would you think would be the demand for prescription drugs? Prescription drugs is something that a medical professional, tells you to get, and you probably have a great need for it if you have some sort of illness or condition, and there might be few substitutes for it. Okay, so here's some estimates for the own price elasticity estimates for drugs. And you can see they're all inelastic, but they're not zero. This is not a perfectly inelastic demand curve for cardiovascular, anti-infective, psychotherapeutic, and anti-ulcer medications. But they are inelastic because there are not a lot of substitutes for these drugs. Okay, the second factor is the time horizon. So as the time horizon lengthens, demand becomes more elastic. And that's because the longer the time period that you have to react to a price increase, the more substitutes that you're able to find. So let's say gas prices go up. Gas prices go up unexpectedly today. They go up significantly. Let's say gas prices double from $3 a gallon to $6 a gallon. And your tank's on empty and you have to get to work. Well, you're going to go buy some gasoline. Okay, you might not fill up your tank, hoping the price goes down, but you're still going to go buy some gasoline. So your coin demanded will fall, but you still have to drive back and forth. But if that price increase persists over time, you're going to try to find substitute transportation modes. You might ride the bus, you might carpool, and you might trade in your big gas guzzler and buy a smaller, more fuel-efficient car. Okay, so the longer that you have, the longer period of time that you have to react to price increase, the more that you can adjust. And so here's some estimates of short-term own price elasticities and long-term own price elasticities. So for transportation, in the short term, demand is inelastic and then becomes elastic in the long term. Food goes from inelastic to elastic. Alcohol and tobacco goes from highly inelastic to still inelastic but close to unitary elastic. And that's probably because of the addictive properties of alcohol and tobacco, that it does not become price elastic. Recreation goods goes from elastic, almost unitary elastic to highly elastic, and clothing goes from just barely inelastic to highly elastic. Again, that's from this paper, Bay, Jansen, and Lee, Advertising Effects in Complete Demand Systems. And we can take a look at that paper, and you can take a look at that paper and figure out how these broad categories of goods are defined and how these time periods are defined. In the expenditure share, this is the amount of money that you spend on the good relative to your budget. You can think of your broadest budget as your income. Okay, as the expenditure share of a good in your budget increases, demand becomes more elastic, and that's because the more money you spend on a good, the more attention you pay to price increases or to price changes. Okay, and as the expenditure share decreases, demand becomes less elastic. Okay, and the best example of this in the textbook, Table 3-2, in the 10th edition, is pepper. The demand is, so even though pepper has few substitutes as a spice, its own price elasticity is minus 0.2, and that's because we don't spend a lot of money on pepper. I could not tell you how much the price of pepper is. And think to yourself, if you buy pepper, do you know what the price is? And when you go to buy pepper, do you walk down the aisle and pick up the pepper and check its price and wonder if it's too expensive or not? Most consumers don't. They grab the pepper, throw it in their cart, and move along. Okay, so we can look at the table 3-2 from the 8th edition. With the expenditure share in mind. Okay, especially let's think of motor vehicles. Okay, so we make a car purchase that's an expensive item, and even though you might not buy a new car but every 2, 3, 5, 10 years, consumers are still very price sensitive because the expenditure share is large. And contrast that with um, something like pepper. There's not a good example in this table of a good with a small expenditure share.